Lieutenant Jake Martinez stood at the window of the diplomatic vessel Horizon's Edge and watched the stars slowly move past. He had been on this ship for 3 months now, and every day felt the same. Wake up, eat breakfast, read reports, attend briefings, and then wait for something important to happen. Today was different, though. Today the Zilarian delegation would arrive, and Jake's job was about to get much more interesting. The purple-skinned aliens were famous throughout the galaxy for being very formal and strict about their social rules. They had a royal family, nobles, and common people, just like humans did long ago. Princess Lyra Velanathi was coming to their ship, and she was the heir to the Zilarian throne. Everyone said she was cold and never smiled. The reports described her as someone who followed every rule perfectly and never showed emotion. Jake had spent weeks reading about Zilarian culture. Their people bowed at specific angles depending on social rank. They used formal language for everything. Even asking for water had to be done in a certain way. If someone made a mistake, it could ruin the whole meeting. Earth needed something from them, and they needed something from Earth. It was Jake's job to make sure no human accidentally insulted anyone. Ambassador Claire Thompson walked into the observation room where Jake was standing. She looked nervous, which was unusual for her. Claire had been a diplomat for 20 years and had met aliens from dozens of different worlds. If she was worried, then this meeting was really important. "Jake, are you ready for this?" she asked, adjusting her formal uniform jacket. "As ready as I can be, Ambassador. I've read every report about Zilarian customs 3 times. Good. Remember, we need access to their quantum crystals. Without them, our new energy systems won't work. And they want our agricultural technology, because their home planet is having food problems. Both sides need this deal to work." Jake nodded. He understood how important this was. The Zilarians had crystals that could power entire cities with clean energy. Humans had developed ways to grow food in harsh conditions. It seemed like a perfect trade, but politics between species was never simple. The ship's communication system made a soft chime. "Attention all personnel. The Zilarian delegation will arrive in 30 minutes. All diplomatic staff report to Docking Bay 2. Jake and Claire walked through the ship's corridors toward the docking bay. Other crew members moved quickly to their positions. Everyone knew this meeting could change the relationship between Earth and the Zilarian Empire. The hallways were cleaner than usual, and the air recycling systems had been adjusted to accommodate Zilarian breathing requirements. When they reached the docking bay, Jake saw the other members of the human delegation already in position. Dr. Susan Blake, the agricultural expert, was reviewing her presentation notes. Captain Roy Henderson, the ship's commander, stood at attention in his dress uniform. 3 other junior diplomats waited nervously near the airlock. "Remember, everyone," Claire said quietly, "bow exactly 15 degrees when you meet Princess Lyra. Don't speak unless she speaks to you first. Keep your hands visible at all times. And whatever you do, don't smile too much." They consider excessive facial expressions to be rude. Jake felt his stomach tighten. He had practiced the bow dozens of times, but now he worried he might get the angle wrong. Through the reinforced window of the airlock, he could see the Zilarian ship approaching. It was sleek and silver, with strange curved sections that didn't look like anything humans would build. The docking process took 10 minutes. Jake watched as the 2 ships connected with a soft metallic sound. The airlock sealed, and green lights indicated that the atmosphere was safe. Everyone in the human delegation stood straighter. The door opened, and the Zilarian delegation entered. Jake's first thought was that they looked more human than he had expected. They walked on 2 legs, had 2 arms, and their faces were in the familiar arrangement of eyes, nose, and mouth. But their skin was a deep purple color, and they were all taller than the average human. Their clothing was elaborate, with intricate patterns that seemed to shift colors as they moved. Princess Lyra Velanathi entered last, and Jake immediately understood why she had such a reputation. She moved with perfect grace, her back straight, and her expression completely neutral. Her purple skin was darker than the others, and she wore a crown-like device that floated just above her head. Her eyes were large and amber-colored, and they seemed to take in everything without showing any emotion. The human delegation bowed in unison. Jake concentrated on getting the angle exactly right. When he straightened up, he noticed something that the briefings hadn't mentioned. Princess Lyra's amber eyes were moving around the room, and there was something in her expression that didn't match her reputation. She looked curious, almost interested, rather than cold and distant. Ambassador Thompson stepped forward and began the formal greeting in the Zilarian language. She had been practicing the pronunciation for weeks. Princess Lyra responded in the same language, and her translator, an older Zilarian male, repeated her words in English. Her Royal Highness Princess Lyra Velanathi welcomes the human delegation and expresses hope for productive negotiations between our peoples. The formal introductions took 20 minutes. Each person was presented individually, with their titles and credentials announced in both languages. Jake was introduced as the cultural liaison, responsible for ensuring proper protocol was followed. When Princess Lyra's eyes met his during the introduction, he thought he saw the slightest flicker of something that might have been interest. The delegation moved to the conference room, where the first day of negotiations would take place. The room had been carefully arranged with 2 long tables facing each other. The human delegation sat on one side, the Zilarians on the other. Princess Lyra sat in the center of her group. With advisors on both sides, Jake's job was to observe and watch for any signs of cultural misunderstanding. He sat slightly behind the main delegation, where he could see both groups clearly. As the talks began, he noticed that Princess Lyra participated actively in the discussions, but she always maintained that neutral expression, however, during the breaks between topics. Jake saw her looking around the room with what appeared to be genuine curiosity. The first day proceeded smoothly. Both sides presented their initial positions and explained what they hoped to achieve. The Zilarians needed Earth's advanced farming techniques to help feed their growing population. The humans needed the quantum crystals to power their expanding colonies. It seemed like a straightforward trade, but Jake knew that alien politics were never simple. As the day ended and the delegations prepared to return to their quarters, Jake found himself wondering about the princess. Her reputation suggested she was cold and calculating, but the brief glimpses he had caught of her expressions told a different story. There was something about her that didn't match the official reports, and Jake was curious to learn more about who she really was beneath the royal mask. The second day of negotiations started early in the morning. Jake arrived at the conference room 30 minutes before the scheduled time to make sure everything was properly arranged. He had spent the previous evening reviewing his notes about Princess Lyra's behavior and found himself more curious about her than he probably should have been when the Zilarian delegation entered. Jake noticed immediately that Princess Lyra looked tired. Her amber eyes seemed less bright than yesterday, and she moved with slightly less grace. Her translator, the older Zilarian named Kekstar, stayed close to her side and kept glancing at her with what looked like concern. The morning session focused on technical details about the quantum crystals. Dr. Blake explained how the crystals could be integrated into human energy systems, while the Zilarian scientists described their agricultural needs. Princess Lyra listened carefully to everything, occasionally asking questions through her translator. Jake noticed that her questions were very intelligent and showed she understood the technical aspects better than some of the other Zilarians. During the first break, something interesting happened. Instead of staying with her delegation, Princess Lyra walked over to the large observation window that looked out into space. She stood there alone, staring at the stars with an expression that Jake had never seen on her face before. It was longing, almost sad, as if she was looking for something she couldn't find. Jake wanted to approach her, but protocol demanded that he not speak to her unless she spoke to him first. He watched from across the room as she stood there for the entire 15-minute break. When Kekstar came to get her, she seemed reluctant to return to the negotiations. The afternoon session was more difficult. The two sides began discussing trade quantities and shipping routes. There were disagreements about security and transportation costs. The Zilarians wanted guarantees that human agricultural technology wouldn't be shared with their enemies, The humans wanted assurances that the quantum crystals would be delivered on schedule. Jake observed that Princess Lyra became more animated during these discussions. She spoke more frequently and seemed to have strong opinions about several topics. However, she still maintained her formal demeanor and never showed emotion in the way humans would. Jake began to realize that what he had initially thought was coldness might actually be careful self-control. On the third day, something unexpected happened that changed everything. The ship's environmental control system malfunctioned during the morning session. The temperature in the conference room began to rise steadily. Within 20 minutes, it had become uncomfortably warm for everyone. Captain Henderson apologized profusely and explained that the repair crew was working to fix the problem. The human delegation began removing their formal jackets and loosening their ties. They were used to dealing with technical problems and adapted quickly to the situation. The Zalarian delegation, however, remained formally dressed despite the heat. They sat perfectly still, maintaining their rigid posture, even as Jake could see they were becoming uncomfortable. Their purple skin began to show a slight sheen of moisture, which Jake assumed was their equivalent of sweating, but Princess Lyra was different. As the temperature rose, something remarkable happened. Her rigid posture began to relax. Her shoulders dropped slightly and she leaned back in her chair. For the first time since Jake had met her, she looked comfortable and natural. The warmth seemed to have an effect on her that was completely opposite to what it had on the other Zalarians. Jake made a mental note of this observation. After the environmental system was repaired and the temperature returned to normal, he watched as Princess Lyra's formal posture gradually returned. It was as if the cooler temperature forced her back into her rigid royal mask. That evening, Jake made a decision that was probably outside his official duties. He accessed the ship's environmental controls and quietly adjusted the temperature in the guest quarters section where Princess Lyra was staying. He increased it by just a few degrees, not enough to be noticeable to most people, but enough to make it warmer than the standard setting. The next morning, Princess Lyra appeared more alert and engaged than she had been since arriving. She participated more actively in the discussions and seemed more comfortable with the human delegation. Jake felt pleased with his small intervention. Even though he couldn't tell anyone about it, it was during the fourth day that Jake first saw Princess Lyra smile. Ambassador Thompson had been explaining some of the challenges of space travel, and she made a joke about human coffee being strong enough to wake the dead. The comment was translated for the Zalarian delegation, and Jake saw Princess Lyra's lips curve upward in what was unmistakably a smile. The expression lasted only for a moment before she composed herself and returned to her neutral expression. But Jake had seen it, and it transformed his understanding of her completely. She wasn't cold or emotionless. She was simply constrained by her position and her culture's expectations. Jake began paying closer attention to Princess Lyra's reactions throughout the negotiations. He noticed that she seemed particularly interested when the humans talked about their culture and daily life. When Dr. Blake mentioned how human farmers work together in communities, sharing knowledge and resources, Princess Lyra leaned forward slightly and asked several detailed questions. The breakthrough moment came on the fifth day. Princess Lyra had been reviewing some technical documents when she accidentally knocked her ceremonial datapad off the table. It fell to the floor with a soft chime, and Jake instinctively moved to pick it up for her. As he handed the device back to her, their hands briefly touched. Her skin felt surprisingly warm, much warmer than human skin. For a moment, they looked directly at each other without the formal distance that had characterized all their previous interactions. "Thank you," she said quietly in accented English. Not waiting for her translator to speak for her. Jake realized this was the first time he had heard her voice speaking his language. Her accent was musical and pleasant, nothing like the formal tone her translator used. The moment lasted only a few seconds, but it felt significant to both of them. After that brief contact, Jake began to notice other small changes in Princess Lyra's behavior. She would occasionally glance in his direction during the negotiations. When the human delegation made jokes or laughed about something, she would watch their interactions with obvious interest. It was as if she was studying them, trying to understand something about human behavior that was foreign to her own culture. Jake found himself wondering what life was like for her on her home planet. Did she have friends? Was she always surrounded by formal protocol and rigid rules? The glimpses he had caught of her personality suggested that there was much more to her than the cold royal image she presented to the galaxy. The negotiations were progressing well, but Jake sensed that something more important was happening. Beneath the surface, Princess Lyra was beginning to show signs of genuine curiosity about humans, and Jake was becoming increasingly interested in understanding the person behind the royal title. The 6th day started like any other, but by noon everything had changed. Jake was reviewing his notes in the conference room when Captain Henderson's voice came over the communication system with an urgent announcement. A massive solar flare had erupted from the nearby star, and the electromagnetic radiation was interfering with all communication systems on the ship. "All diplomatic activities are suspended until further notice," Henderson announced. "The communication blackout will last at least 12 hours while we wait for the solar activity to subside and complete repairs to our systems." Jake looked around the conference room where both delegations had been preparing for the afternoon session. Ambassador Thompson was already talking with her team about what to do during the unexpected break. The Zilarian delegation seemed confused by the sudden change in schedule, and Kekstar was explaining the situation to Princess Lyra in their own language. "Well, this is unprecedented," Thompson said to Jake. "We've never had an unscheduled break like this during formal negotiations. I suppose everyone will just have to return to their quarters and wait." The senior diplomats and advisors began filing out of the conference room, discussing the technical problems and how long the repairs might take. Jake gathered his materials slowly, not eager to return to his small quarters for hours of waiting. As he stood to leave, he noticed that Princess Lyra was still in the room, standing near the large observation window. She was alone, which was unusual. Kekstar and the other Zilarian advisors had left with the rest of the delegation. Princess Lyra stood with her back to the room, looking out at the space where the solar flare was creating beautiful but dangerous streams of charged particles. The sight was actually quite spectacular, like a cosmic firework display. Jake hesitated. At the door, protocol suggested that he should leave her alone and return to his quarters like everyone else. But something about the way she stood there, isolated and seemingly forgotten, made him reconsider. He had been observing her for days and had begun to think of her as more than just a diplomatic figure. He made a decision that would change everything. Instead of leaving, Jake walked over to the observation window and stood a respectful distance away from her. For several minutes, they both watched the solar flare in silence. The streams of energy were beautiful and dangerous at the same time, painting the darkness of space with brilliant colors. "It's beautiful," Princess Lyra said softly, speaking in English without her translator present. Jake was surprised to hear her voice again. This was only the second time she had spoken directly to him in his language. Her accent was even more musical when she wasn't being formal. "You speak our language pretty well," Jake replied, moving slightly closer to the window. "I've been studying human culture for years," she admitted, then quickly added, "for diplomatic purposes, of course." There was something in her tone that suggested that diplomatic purposes weren't the only reason she had learned English. Jake sensed that she was more interested in human culture than her position required her to be. They stood in comfortable silence for several more minutes, watching the solar phenomenon that had disrupted their carefully planned schedule. Jake noticed that Princess Lyra seemed more relaxed than he had ever seen her, without her advisors present and without the formal structure of the negotiations. She appeared to be allowing herself to be more natural. "Are you always surrounded by people?" Jake asked gently. "Always," she replied with a slight sigh. "Royal protocol requires that I have advisors present during all official activities. Even my meals are formal events with proper procedures." Jake tried to imagine what that kind of life would be like. Never being alone, never being able to speak casually or act naturally. It sounded exhausting and lonely, despite being surrounded by people constantly. "That must be difficult," he said. It's the only life I've ever known, Princess Lyra replied. But watching your delegation these past few days, I've begun to understand that there are other ways to live. Jake was intrigued by this comment. What do you mean? Your people laugh together, make jokes, show concern for each other in small ways. When Dr. Blake was tired yesterday, Ambassador Thompson brought her coffee without being asked. When Captain Henderson made a mistake during his presentation, your entire delegation smiled supportively instead of showing disappointment. These behaviors are fascinating to me. Jake realized that what seemed normal to humans was completely foreign to Zolarian culture. The casual affection and mutual support that humans took for granted was something Princess Lyra had probably never experienced. It's just how we are, Jake said. We care about each other, even people we've just met. Yes, Princess Lyra said, turning to look at him directly for the first time since they had started talking. That's what I find so remarkable about your species. The moment felt significant to Jake. Here was this alien princess, heir to an entire empire, and she was envious of something as simple as human friendship. Without the formal structure of the negotiations and the presence of advisors, she was revealing something much deeper about herself. Feeling bold and wanting to lighten the mood, Jake decided to demonstrate exactly what she was talking about. He turned to face her with a casual smile and said, "Hey, sweetie, don't look so worried. We'll get through this." The effect was immediate and completely unexpected. Princess Lyra's purple skin flushed a deep violet color, almost red, and she spun to face him with wide amber eyes. For a moment, Jake thought he had made a terrible mistake. Maybe the casual endearment had been offensive or inappropriate in ways he didn't understand, but then something wonderful happened. Princess Lyra's expression changed from shock to something that looked like delight. A smile spread across her face, broader and more genuine than the brief one Jake had glimpsed days earlier. "Yes, darling," she replied, her voice warm and amused. "I suppose we will?" The moment hung in the air between them, both of them realizing what had just happened. Jake had used a casual term of endearment that humans thought nothing of, and Princess Lyra had responded in kind. It was such a small thing, but it felt revolutionary. Then they both burst into laughter. It started as quiet chuckles but grew into genuine, shared amusement at the absurdity of the situation. Here was a human calling an alien princess sweetie, and she was calling him darling in return. It was so far from proper diplomatic protocol that it was almost unthinkable. Their laughter echoed in the empty conference room, mixing human and Zolarian expressions of joy in a way that had probably never happened before in the history of either species. The solar flare continued to paint the space outside with brilliant colors, but neither of them was watching it anymore. When their laughter finally subsided, they looked at each other with new understanding. The formal barrier between them had cracked, revealing two people who were curious about each other despite coming from completely different worlds. "I've never been called sweetie before," Princess Lyra said, still smiling. "I've never called an alien princess darling before either." Jake replied. They laughed again, softer this time, both aware that something important had just changed between them. The negotiations would continue when the communications were restored, but the relationship between Jake Martinez and Princess Lyra Velanathi would never be the same. After their shared laughter died down, Princess Lyra and Jake stood in the observation lounge looking at each other with something that felt like wonder. The formal mask that Princess Lyra had worn for the entire week had completely fallen away, and Jake could see the real person underneath for the first time. "I should explain something," Princess Lyra said, her voice softer than Jake had ever heard it. "What you just did, calling me sweetie, it means more to my people than you might realize." Jake felt a moment of concern. "Did I offend you? I didn't mean to be disrespectful." "No, not at all," she replied quickly. "It's the opposite. In Zolarian culture, we have very strict rules about how people address each other. Everything is based on rank and social position. Even members of the same family use formal titles most of the time. Casual terms of affection like what you just used are reserved only for the most intimate relationships." Jake began to understand why she had reacted so strongly. So when I called you sweetie, it was like I was treating you as if we were close friends or family. Exactly. And when I called you darling in return, I was accepting that closeness. It's something I've never done before with anyone outside my immediate family. Princess Lyra walked back to the observation window, and Jake followed her. The solar flare was still creating beautiful patterns in space, but now it seemed less important than their conversation. Your species fascinates me, she continued. I've been studying human behavior for years, and I still don't fully understand how you can be so open with your affection. You call strangers honey and dear without thinking about it. You hug people you've just met. You smile at everyone, even people you don't know. Jake had never thought about these behaviors as being unusual. To humans, casual affection was just a normal part of social interaction. It's just how we show that we care about each other. Even if we don't know someone well, we can still be kind and friendly. We have no equivalent to this in Zolarian society, Princess Lyra said with a note of sadness in her voice. Every interaction is formal and distant. Even when I was a child, I had to address my parents with their proper titles in public. I've never had what you would call a casual friend. Jake felt a surge of sympathy for her. He tried to imagine growing up without ever experiencing the simple warmth of human friendship. No wonder she had been so fascinated by the way his delegation interacted with each other. Is that why you requested to lead this diplomatic mission? Jake asked. Because you wanted to understand humans better? Princess Lyra nodded. Officially, I'm here because the trade agreement is important to our empire. But personally, I volunteered because I wanted to see for myself how your people live and interact with each other. I've read every report about human culture that our intelligence services have gathered, but reading about something and seeing it are very different. What did you think when you first met us? I was surprised by how relaxed you all were, even during formal negotiations. Ambassador Thompson made jokes, Dr. Blake shared personal stories about her family, and Captain Henderson apologized for small mistakes instead of pretending they didn't happen. In Zolarian culture, showing any sign of imperfection or vulnerability during negotiations would be considered a serious weakness. Jake realized that what humans considered normal diplomatic behavior was actually quite brave by Zolarian standards. Their willingness to be genuine and show their personalities had been an act of courage that Princess Lyra had probably never witnessed before. You said you've been studying our culture for years, Jake said. What interests you most about it? Princess Lyra was quiet for a moment, as if she was trying to find the right words. The freedom you have to be yourselves. When I watched your delegation, I saw people who could express their opinions, make mistakes, and still be respected by their colleagues. You support each other even when you disagree about things. And that's different from how things work in your empire. Very different. In Zolarian society, showing uncertainty or admitting mistakes can destroy your reputation permanently. Everyone must appear perfect and in control at all times. The social hierarchy is rigid, and stepping outside your assigned role is considered dangerous. Jake began to understand why Princess Lyra had seemed so constrained during the negotiations. She wasn't naturally cold or emotionless. She was protecting herself from the political consequences of showing vulnerability. That sounds exhausting, Jake said. It is, she admitted. I've been preparing for this role my entire life, learning to control every expression and reaction. But watching your people has made me realize that there might be other ways to live. They stood in comfortable silence for a while, both looking out at the stellar phenomenon that had given them this unexpected opportunity to talk. Jake found himself genuinely liking Princess Lyra, not as a diplomatic figure, but as a person. She was intelligent, thoughtful, and much more curious about the world than her formal behavior had suggested. Can I ask you something? Princess Lyra. Sod, of course. When you called me sweetie, was it just a casual expression, or did you mean something more by it? Jake considered his answer carefully. It was casual at first, just something I said to try to make you feel better. But I think I was also responding to something I had noticed about you all week. You seemed lonely, even when you were surrounded by people. Princess Lyra looked at him with surprise. You noticed that? It was my job to observe and watch for cultural problems, but I found myself paying attention to you specifically. You always seemed interested in what we were doing, but you had to hide your curiosity behind that formal mask. You're very perceptive, she said. I was lonely. I've been lonely most of my life? Royal protocol keeps me isolated from genuine connections with other people. What happens when you return to your home planet? Jake asked. Will you have to go back to the formal behavior? Princess Lyra sighed deeply. I suppose I will. This conversation we're having right now would be impossible there. I would never be allowed to speak so freely with a foreign diplomat, especially not without my advisors present. That seems like a waste, Jake said. You're much more interesting when you're being yourself. Princess Lyra smiled at the compliment. Thank you. That's probably the nicest thing anyone has said to me in years. Jake felt a sense of sadness at the thought of Princess Lyra returning to her constrained life. She had shown him glimpses of a curious, intelligent person who was trapped by her position and her culture's expectations. Maybe things don't have to stay the same, Jake said. Maybe this experience will help you find ways to be more genuine, even within your own society. Perhaps, Princess Lyra said hopefully. This conversation has certainly shown me that it's possible to connect with someone from a completely different world. If I can do that, maybe I can find ways to connect with my own people too. The communication system crackled to life, indicating that the repairs were nearly complete. Soon, the formal negotiations would resume, and they would both have to return to their official roles. But something fundamental had changed between them, and Jake suspected it would affect everything that happened next. The communication system came back online 3 hours later, and Captain Henderson announced that normal ship operations would resume. Jake and Princess Lyra had spent the entire time talking in the observation lounge, sharing stories about their different worlds and cultures. When the announcement came, they both felt disappointed that their private conversation had to end. I suppose we should return to the negotiations, Princess Lyra said, but she made no move to leave the window where they had been standing. I suppose we should, Jake agreed, equally reluctant to break the connection they had built. When they finally returned to the conference room, the change in Princess Lyra was immediately obvious to everyone. She still maintained her royal bearing, but there was a warmth in her manner that hadn't been there before. She smiled slightly when she greeted the human delegation, and her posture was more relaxed than it had been all week. Ambassador Thompson noticed the difference right away. During a brief break between sessions, she pulled Jake aside with a curious expression. What happened during the communication blackout? She asked. Princess Lyra seems completely different, more approachable somehow. Jake wasn't sure how much he should reveal about their private conversation. We talked for a while about human and Zalarian culture. I think she's more interested in understanding our ways than we realized. Well, whatever you discussed, it's had a positive effect. She's been much more engaged in the negotiations this afternoon. Thompson was right. Princess Lyra was participating more actively in the discussions than she had since arriving. She asked thoughtful questions and offered suggestions that showed she understood both sides of the trade agreement. More importantly, she seemed genuinely interested in finding solutions that would benefit both species. The other Zalarians in her delegation seemed puzzled by the change in their princess. Kekstar, her translator, kept giving her questioning. Looks as if he couldn't understand why she was behaving differently. But Princess Lyra appeared comfortable with her new approach to the negotiations. On the 7th day, Ambassador Thompson made a suggestion that surprised everyone. Instead of continuing with the formal negotiation structure they had been using, she proposed breaking into smaller working groups to focus on specific aspects of the trade agreement. I think we might make faster progress if we can work more collaboratively, Thompson explained to both delegations. Rather than sitting across from each other at separate tables, we could mix our teams and tackle different issues together. The Zalarian delegation looked uncertain about this proposal. It was completely different from their normal diplomatic procedures. But Princess Lyra spoke up immediately in support of the idea. I think Ambassador Thompson's suggestion has merit, she said through her translator. Perhaps a more cooperative approach would help us understand each other's needs better. Jake watched as the other Zellurians exchanged glances. It was clear that Princess Lyra's willingness to try new approaches was influencing their decisions. After a brief discussion in their own language, they agreed to Thompson's proposal. The new format worked remarkably well. Jake found himself working with Princess Lyra and two other advisors on developing cultural exchange protocols, which had been added to the trade agreement at Princess Lyra's suggestion. She believed that the two species could benefit from sharing more than just goods and technology. Working in the smaller group, Jake got to see even more of Princess Lyra's genuine personality. She was curious about everything, asking detailed questions about human education, art, and social customs. She seemed particularly interested in how humans formed friendships and maintained relationships across long distances. Your people stay connected with friends even when they live on different planets, she observed. Zellurians rarely maintain relationships outside their immediate social circle. Technology makes it easier, Jake explained. But mostly it's because we value those connections. Friends are important to us even if we can't see them often. Princess Lyra nodded thoughtfully. I'm beginning to understand why your delegation works so well together. You genuinely care about each other's success. The collaborative approach transformed the entire negotiation process. By working together instead of maintaining formal distances, both sides began to understand each other's real needs and concerns. The Zellurians learned that humans were willing to share their agricultural technology freely, because they believed that helping others was the right thing to do. The humans learned that the Zellurians' formal behavior came from a desire to show respect, not from coldness or superiority. Jake noticed that Princess Lyra's influence was spreading to the other Zellurians. They began to relax their formal postures slightly and showed more interest in understanding human culture. Kekstar even smiled when Dr. Blake made a joke about the complexity of crop rotation schedules. The breakthrough came during the final day of negotiations. The two sides had been discussing security arrangements for the trade routes when a disagreement arose about inspection procedures. The Zellurians wanted very strict controls, while the humans preferred a more trusting approach. Princess Lyra listened to both sides present their arguments, then stood up and addressed the entire group in English, speaking directly instead of using her translator. I have learned something important this week, she said, her accent giving her words a musical quality. Trust is not built through strict controls and formal procedures. It is built through understanding and genuine connection between people. She looked directly at Jake as she continued. The humans have shown us that it is possible to work together as equals, even when we come from very different worlds. Perhaps we should base our security arrangements on this principle of mutual respect rather than on suspicion. The room was quiet as everyone absorbed her words. Jake felt proud of her for speaking so openly and for choosing to use English instead of hiding behind her translator. It was a small but significant gesture that showed how much she had changed during their time together. Ambassador Thompson smiled broadly. Princess Lyra, I think you've just solved our last major disagreement. If we approach security as partners rather than as potential adversaries, we can create procedures that work for both our peoples. The final agreement was signed in the observation lounge where Jake and Princess Lyra had first laughed together. It included not only the trade arrangements for quantum crystals and agricultural technology, but also provisions for cultural exchange programs and regular diplomatic visits. As Princess Lyra signed the historic document, she looked up at Jake and winked. It was such a small gesture, but it meant everything to him. She had learned to express herself in ways that her culture had never taught her. After the signing ceremony, the delegations began preparing for departure. The Zellurian ship would leave the next morning, taking Princess Lyra back to her empire. And her royal duties that evening, Princess Lyra approached Jake privately. They met again in the observation lounge, where everything had changed between them. Thank you, she said, speaking English without any formal protocols. Thank you for showing me that it's possible to be genuine with another person, even when they're from a completely different world. Jake smiled at her. Thank you for trusting me enough to let me see who you really are behind all the royal formality. I'm going to try to bring some of what I've learned here back to my people, she said. It won't be easy, but I think there are ways to honor our traditions while still allowing for genuine connections between people. I believe you can do it, Jake replied. You've already proven that you're brave enough to change when you see a better way. Princess Lyra smiled, that same genuine expression he had first glimpsed when she accidentally smiled at Ambassador Thompson's joke. Until we meet again, sweetie, she said with a soft laugh. Jake grinned back at her. See you later, darling. As her ship departed the next morning, Jake watched from the observation window and reflected on how a simple moment of casual, human affection had transformed a formal diplomatic mission into something much more meaningful. Princess Lyra had learned that genuine connection was possible between any two people, regardless of species or social rank. And Jake had learned that sometimes the most important diplomatic breakthroughs happen when you stop worrying about protocol and simply treat someone with kindness and respect. The trade agreement they had negotiated would bring benefits to both their worlds for generations to come. But more importantly, they had proven that understanding between different species was possible when people were willing to be genuine with each other. Their accidental moment of connection had opened a door to a new kind of relationship between humans and Zolarians, one based on friendship rather than just formal cooperation.